So yeah, we're going to talk about curb appeal here. And I invariably start the question of, why do we care about curb appeal? We may think that it's not an important component, but the economics of it is that it adds to our property values. It makes our places more marketable. But then there's other aspects of it that have a needed component as well. And much like fabrics and textiles make the interior of our homes more livable and more pleasant and better quality of life, then plants on the outside act as fabrics to really integrate those structures into its surroundings. And if you ever wonder if landscape is really all that important, all you have to do is look at a house where there is basically no landscaping and how harsh that seems. Even in really nice houses, it just doesn't seem like it fits in. So curb appeal, what it does is it does things like adds to our quality of life. If there's a tree in the front yard, it shades our yard. We like those tree-lined streets. All of those factors funnel in toward making curb appeal an important component of landscape design and housing values. So it's a big thing. So let's go through some things that will make a difference here. Okay, the first and foremost important component is to decide on a style. And a lot of times the house itself will dictate the style of the curb appeal that's going on around it. So for instance, Victorian houses are known for their gingerbread, their over the top ornamentation on the outside of the house. And so they almost need a garden space around them that's over the top as well, just to make it kind of fit into it. If you think of maybe a Frank Lloyd Wright's style house, then what's going to happen is that if you have an over the top style of landscaping around it, it's not going to fit. So a lot of times the house itself is going to dictate, what kind of curb appeal it's going to be created for that house. But also your own tastes have a reflection on that. And the biggest one that I ask a lot of people is, curved lines or straight lines? What is your style as far as implementing for your curb appeal? Most people like the curved design, mostly because they like that informal style. They like how it softens the very rigid architecture of a house. And so that's certainly something that you can do. But I have seen instances where straight lines are used in a landscape and it's still very informal. So it just depends. It's not a matter of the straight lines alone. It's the choice of the plants and where they're placed that really determines whether it's a more formal design or not. So on the house on the right here, you can see that we do have some straight lines. We do have, this row of boxwood across the front of the house. But as you get closer to the front door, these bed lines are curved. And so there is no law that says you have to do all straight lines or all curved lines. It can be a mixture of lines as well. So deciding on the style is going to be an important component here. Okay. We talk a lot about focal points when it comes to landscape design. And so we're used to features like water features and statuary and maybe a prized plant that all act as focal points. But when we're talking about the front of the yard, we're naturally talking about the front door. That's just a given, needs the focal point. And for that reason, then, it calls on us to really place our larger plant materials toward the outer sides of the house. So the outer edges of the house will have these larger plant materials. And then as we get closer to the front door, it's almost a V-shaped effect of things getting lower as we get to the front door. okay? And a lot of times, the things that call our attention to them, so things like flowers or fine textured things, things that wave gently in the breeze, those are the things that invite our attention to them. And so we'll want those things close to the front door. Whereas the coarser textured things, the larger things, are going to be towards the outer edge. Now, in this particular diagram, hands down, it's way overplanted. I mean, there's a lot going on here, and I'm not telling you that that's the way to do it. Really, what I want you to take note of is the fact that, you know, the larger things go out toward the outer edges, smaller things as you get towards the front door. And there's actually some very practical reasons why we're doing that as well. So in this particular instance, we have lots and lots of focal points, okay? So anytime we see things outside of the normal green range of plant materials, so here we see blue colored things, we see yellow colored things, we see kind of these burgundy colored things all mixed in here. All of these act as focal points, and it really ends up being too busy. It's really more about having different things take center stage at different times of the year. So maybe there's just one thing that flowers in the spring, a couple of things during the summer, and a different thing in the fall. All those things take a little orchestration, but having all of these things going on at once really makes it busier than our intention is. And remember what I said about a lot of these details need to be concentrated towards the front door. So when we take those details and we spread them out all the way across the front of the house, it's almost hard to tell where our eye should land. And so too much detail can be a real problem. These things would be better off if more of them were concentrated towards that front door area rather than spread out all over the place. Another factor to keep in mind is safety issues. And clearly, when we're putting plant material that's too large by the front door area, that's a concern from a safety standpoint, in that, you know, if there's a potential burglar that can hide behind that large material, then that's something that is not only a safety feature that I'm talking about right now, but it also doesn't follow that guideline for creating that V-shaped effect with the larger plant material at the edges. So you can see that large plant materials near the front door really aren't a good thing to do. Ultimately, you know, we want to draw people to the front door. And in this image on the far left here, you don't quite know where that door is, and that's because of that abundance of plant material. And then things like thorns placed near walkways or paths near a front porch don't make sense. I mean, these things are grabbing at your clothes, you're grabbing at your skin. If you have toddlers in the area, you know, those are all safety things. So having those materials like roses and barberry near a walkway doesn't make a lot of sense, even though they're well suited to it because a lot of them are smaller. We really don't want to place them there because of that safety issue. And then things like ornamental grasses. You know, if you have pets that are using your pathways, those edges of the ornamental grasses could slice into their eyes. And so that's a safety feature as well. So being cognizant of those kind of things, and it's, I'm not saying don't include them, it's just that you're going to put them a little further away from those pathways. Then think about the kind of plant care that you want to take place. I get asked a lot of times about no maintenance landscapes, and frankly, there is no such thing as a no maintenance landscape. Everything is either low maintenance or gradations of maintenance above that area. And low maintenance is certainly doable, but it's really about picking your battles. So on this image on the left, where the owner has chosen to hedge literally every plant in that landscape, what you've created then is an automatic maintenance chore, because anytime that growth occurs beyond that hedged area, it's immediately going to look out of place. Not a lot of plan was given to the plants here. They're literally giving up some of their sidewalk so that those plants can be there. And my idea is that if you really don't want the plant to be so large to begin with, then why not choose one that naturally stays smaller in stature so that you don't have that added level of care that goes with it. In this image on the right, you can see that these bubbles of mulched areas around the trees are very artistic. It's interesting to look at architecturally, but the issue associated with this is the amount of mowing that you're going to do. So the stopping and starting, the moving around that you have to do rather than doing a clean line. So those are going to be factors that go into what you're thinking of as far as plant care goes. The next thing you want to do is add a tree. You know, why not add a tree? If you're lucky enough that you already have a tree in your landscape, then, you know, you don't need to necessarily add a tree. But one of the trends that we're seeing is that house sizes are getting larger while our lot sizes are getting smaller. And in those instances, putting a tree in the front yard may be a challenge. Maybe your neighbors on either side of you have trees in place already and there isn't room for you to have a tree. But the aesthetics of a tree-lined street are very large. If your house faces south, then you can place a tree so that it maybe shades the pavement area a little bit and reduces that heat island effect. If your house faces north, you can place the tree so that it shades the house itself and helps with energy costs of cooling the house during the summer months. So adding a tree is a big factor in just the pure joy of being in the landscape. And a lot of times that size of the tree will be dictated by the size of the house itself. And so there's a lot of smaller trees that can go in to our landscape. This image is a good way to show you what not to do when you're adding a tree. So in this particular case, and you'll see this tree again, unfortunately I have a lot of images of trees that are kind of having a rough time of it, but what you'll notice here is that probably what occurred is that the tree was planted in the ground first, and at some point the owner made the decision to beautify the space around the tree by adding this raised bed, which is a big no-no. And so consequently, you're seeing lots of bark sloughing off from the trunk itself. You know, there's landscaping fabric here, another big no-no. There's rock here around the base of the tree, another big no-no. All of these things have made for an unhappy tree. So this particular owner is going to make the choice very soon of taking out this tree and what's the new tree that they'll put in its place. So if you are adding a tree and you really want to have that raised bed, the order of things is that you put the raised bed in first and then plant the tree at the proper depth according to the soil level inside that raised bed. And with the consciousness that we're having of telephone wires and electrical lines and things like that, a lot of our trees are now smaller in stature. And so these trees are nice choices. So a smaller, medium-sized tree is a good choice for, say, like a ranch style house, but maybe for a 2-story house, you'll want something larger. Really, in the front yard, the tree should be a good scale according to the house. So trees in the backyard, they can be large, no problem. But in the front of the house, we really need to scale those trees to fit with the architecture of the house. So whether it's a 1-story or 2-story will dictate how large a tree you choose. Traditionally, a lot of times the front yard was felt to be land that you didn't necessarily own. It belonged to the street, and whatever you did had to go with the covenants that were going on within your neighborhood association. And so a lot of times we didn't really do things for our front yard that put us into them. The consequences of that, though, were that there's less interactions. We're out in our front yards less, so we're interacting with our neighbors and friends less because people don't see us there. And so I'm a strong believer, and I think it's a great trend that we're seeing more of these things move to where people are utilizing their front yard spaces. And I'm not saying they're overwhelming those spaces, but they're doing some really creative things. So, you know, putting a fountain almost directly in front of front doors is unheard of. But this works for this architecture of this house. The bench is a nice touch too, because everybody has the visitors that, you know, you're walking them to their car and it's taking you 15 minutes just to walk them to their car because you're yakking up a storm, and having those little spots where you can do that transition from the inside to the outside is always helpful. It invites conversation. It gets us into talking more to everyone else. And so when you're going to get your mail and you run into your neighbor, you can sit for a spell and talk about things before going on about your day. So really create the space so that you can utilize it beyond what it is meaning as far as, you know, the front yard belonging to the neighborhood. A lot of times our front yards are the only spot where we have some really decent sunlight. And if you like having vegetable gardens and there's just really not space in your backyard because of the amount of shade that's there, why not use an edible landscape approach to the front yard? And so you can integrate some really beautiful things like these purple-headed cabbages into the landscape to really boost the curb appeal and still feed you. And so edible landscaping is about using plants that have architectural beauty, but food as well. So, you know, rhubarb with that monstrous leaf and those bright red stalks are really an architectural plant. Even asparagus can be to a certain extent with that frond-like foliage of them. So edible landscaping is something that can be integrated into the front yard as well. And then even a spot to maybe have your coffee in the morning, or, you know, have a light lunch outside, anything like that, that you can utilize that space. And if privacy is a concern, there's all kinds of really cool ways that you can integrate those outdoor spaces so that you still have privacy. And that's just a matter of fencing or lattice work that's maybe something that's low enough so that when you sit down, you're hidden, but when you stand up, you can see beyond that area. Is a real simple technique to really boost your utilization of that space. And then we can't forget that it's not just us that use the space. There's other organisms out there that utilize the space as well. Certainly birds appreciate it when you're planting things like Rudbeckia that has seed in it over the winter months that they can utilize when other seed sources are buried underneath snow. And then our pollinators and our butterflies, those are things that benefit from the native flowers that we put in. So think of beyond just how we're using it and maybe include things beyond that. It makes our landscapes feel more alive, and it really benefits those organisms that otherwise would have a reduced number of food sources. There was a University of Missouri research that looked into, you know, how big a space do you need to benefit pollinators? Does it need to be, you know, a half acre? Does it need to be, you know, a city lot size? I mean, what size does it take? And the really reassuring research that came out of that found that any size garden that benefits pollinators is good overall. And that's because, you know, the tiny little balcony garden all the way up to, you know, the 4-acre meadow are all beneficial and to get taken together. So when everyone does this, this is a really easy way to benefit pollinators. So think beyond how you utilize the space and think of other things as well. Then we're going to plan for the space the lawn occupies. I can hear you say now, what in the world does she mean by that? And really what we want you to have is an interesting shape for the lawn itself. And so in this diagram, we have a bird's eye view of a front landscape, and we can see that the image on the left of this diagram is really quite busy. I mean, not only do we have real squiggly lines, but we have plants that are thrown into the lawn space area, rather than on the right here where the lawn is planned for, and what's happening here is the lawn itself, in and of itself, has an interesting shape, okay? So that is a factor that we want to do. Not only does it minimize the amount of lawn care that we have to do, and hands down the largest, the most time-consuming of all of the plants in our landscape, lawns, we minimize it and we make it a planned feature of that space rather than simply all the leftover space goes to lawn. We also want to eliminate those odd little spaces of lawn where it's maybe only half of a mower wide, and so we're running that resource over that half wide piece of lawn when really we could eliminate that space altogether and not have to mow it at all. So make the lawn an interesting shape. Okay, we can have those lines too squiggly. This particular one, there's an added step of getting out the weed eater to trim next to those deeper areas inside that retaining wall. And so that creates another level of management, but it also makes it a little too busy. So if you are doing curved lines, they need to be big and broad and gentle in their scope, rather than really wiggly. And so in this particular landscape, you can see that they've done a pretty good job of making this a very broad, rounded area for the lawn. It has an interesting shape. From my perspective, it would have been nice to maybe find a way to include mulching that tree into that landscape as well, and see how on the left here, it curves outward to meet the sidewalk. It would be nice if that same curve was matched on this side. So just a couple of tiny things that would be nice, but again, it's a pretty good job of having that that lawn have an interesting shape in and of itself. So containers. Containers are fun because there is nothing more powerful in the landscape than containers for drawing you to a particular space. And in looking at this particular image, you can see that it's a rather dark house. There's shading that's going on that front porch area. The door itself is rather dark. If it weren't for those two containers, you would be hard pressed to say where the front door was exactly. And so really what those containers are signaling is, here's the front door, here's the way that you need to come to the front door. And so containers are a really powerful way to move people into the landscape. And because a lot of times those containers are at a level that we can see them up close, we can smell them. If they're an interesting texture, we can touch them. We're really talking about inviting that human interaction that goes with containers. And so we really need to place those containers at points where we're likely to enjoy them. The problem with this particular image is that, I believe what the owner was thinking when they placed containers along the side of the house is that they wanted to make the transition from the front yard to the backyard more interesting. It didn't work in this case, okay? Because really, those containers are almost a wasted resource because they're really not inviting you to interact with them because this area is seen as more transitional. There's no destination really intended here. And so those things, if they're seen as a resource, would be better concentrated maybe as a grouping on either side of the area into the backyard so that it funnels people through that area, and that would be a wise way to use containers. And when we're not doing one flanking either side, like we are in the first image, then if we're doing a grouping of them, it's best to do odd numbers. We like odd numbers, they're more interesting to us. So 3s, 5s, 7s, any of those kind of things would be a good thing when you're doing that. And then the final component is adding plants to this landscape. After all, we're talking about landscape design and how it affects curb appeal. And there's landscape design principles that are going to have a lot of impact on this space. And all of these things that I have listed here are things you've probably done before in the past yourself. Maybe not knowing why you did them, but you've done them. And so let's go through these and talk about what they mean in a landscape, okay? So layering plants. We want to get away from that single layer of plants that go completely around a house. 50 years ago, when our foundations were kind of ugly, the importance of landscape foundation plants was important because it hid our foundation. It masked that ugliness of our foundation. That is no longer true. We actually have really handsome foundations. And so we want to group those plants so that rather than looking like they've been painted on the house like soldiers, that they actually add some visual depth to that landscape. And so layering plants so that one touches another, touches another, touches another is a good way to transition. And a lot of our landscapes will have these sidewalks with these little odd areas in between the house and the sidewalk. And it's really hard to get that layering of depth that you need to make that look right. And so one easy thing we can do is borrow space on the other side of the sidewalk to give that layering depth that you need to really transition people from the driveway, in this case, to the house. And so it's all about layering the plants in order to make that a success. And so again, touching one another so that the eye sweeps and follows this curve. So we have a really gorgeous curve in this front area, a really interesting shape of the turf grass area. And they're using Vinca minor to transition this whole curve and reinforce that curve. And so it really adds a depth of layering to the landscape that looks good. And sometimes when landscape resources are maybe limited, I'd rather see people do more layering with the limited number of plants they can buy rather than spread them out and really smear them through the landscape to make them last as far as they can. So it's really about maybe having a few spots where the foundation shows so that you can achieve that layering in other places. I'm sure you've heard of this saying before, right plant, right place. And none of us wants to be this landscape, right? None of us wants to have this particular thought where people look at it and say, now what were they thinking? Nobody wants to be that landscape. And maybe privacy was a huge issue at the time that these plants were put in. And then at some point they began to overwhelm the space, and the response was that to hedge those. Only heck, now we don't have a ladder that's tall enough to really hedge all of it. So now we have a series of pineapples across the front of the house. So this is all an example of, it may be in the right plant, but it may not be the right place for it. It may have been better suited to a hedgerow or collecting them somewhere else in a grouping. And so that's going to play a major factor. And I get asked this all the time, so I'm going to just talk about it up front, is a lot of times someone will ask me about a particular shrub that they really have their heart set on having in the front landscape. And it may not be the right plant for that particular area because of the size that plant gets. And invariably when I mention that to them, their response is, yes, but can I just keep it pruned to keep it smaller? And of course the response is yes, you can certainly do that. But that adds another layer of management and plant care to the landscape. And keep in mind that you're fighting against the natural tendency of that plant to get bigger, and you're committing yourself lifelong to that plant, to managing the size of it. So a lot of times when a plant is too large for a space, it makes more sense to choose things that stay a little bit smaller. So this shrub on the other side of the rock is called Nicodutzia, and it's a really nice small shrub. It's well suited for small landscapes, and it's not going to get anything that overwhelms the space and really overshadows the beautiful rock that's going on around here too. And hybridizers are certainly aware of the need for more small landscape plants. And so there's all kinds of inroads that are being made into having these smaller size plants. So right plant, right place is going to be a critical factor. And a lot of times when people are addressing their landscapes, before they've done a single thing in their landscape, what they're doing is they're saying where their favorite lilac goes. And really that's almost too soon. You need to think in the broader terms of overall aesthetics of the house before you start placing those plants. So it's really about being design conscious first and plant placement second. Then the idea of repeating something, and you've heard me mention this before, but it adds to something called unity in a landscape. It makes a comprehensive whole. Our mind picks up the fact that, oh, I've seen this plant before, and it connects those things and it makes the landscape more unified. So even if you're repeating something from the front yard to the backyard, that's a good type of repetition to have. And in this case, we have lots of little boxwoods that are really uniting this landscape, and that's a good repetition. There's another kind of repetition called rhythm. Rhythm is a repeating of something, but not a repeating of the exact same thing. So in this first image, we have the exact same thing, in this case, boxwood, being repeated throughout. Whereas in this landscape on the right, it's really the coloration that is the factor that's uniting this landscape and is really providing that rhythm of repetition. And so we've got the colors on the house, the colors on the mailbox, even the colors of the lavender flowers at the base of the mailbox, the hyacinth bean, the color of the window boxes. All of these things are a rhythm that's repeating something. And so that's something that we need to do. And I know a lot of you are master gardeners, and as master gardeners, we like our collection of plants, and so we have one of everything. And so it's a little harder to achieve that repetition for us, but we can do that in other ways that maybe are a little more subtle. So maybe the flower colors are similar, even though they're different plants. Maybe the foliage texture is similar, even though they're different plants. And so that's a real easy way to repeat something, even when you're having a lot of different things. We want to properly space things. So again, we don't want to be that house, make a left at the house where the tree ate it. We don't want to be known as that, right? And in this case, it's not just, the front door that's obscured, so you don't have that focal point there. But, a good chunk of the driveway has been lost to this tree. And a lot of times when we purchase the tree and it's all of you know, 2 feet tall when we put it into the ground, it may seem like the perfect choice for that particular landscape. But in that case, you know, we forget that things grow. And, you know, imagine this same tree if it was placed maybe a little to the right of this area. It's sloping off tremendously in this space, and you need something visually to kind of fill that space more. Wouldn't it make more sense to have this spruce in that particular space rather than obscuring the front door? And the sad part about this is that, you know, the new owner of the house was well aware of, you know, just how massive this tree was in scale and proportion to the rest of the yard and the house itself. And so they limbed up the tree. They limbed up the tree to get that sightline clearance. You could see beneath it. They didn't really care for how that looked, and now that tree is gone altogether. So it's really about thinking ahead and spacing those things properly ahead of time rather than having to retroactively go in and do something about it. Okay. When we're adding plants, we're looking for a visual weight that has to do with scale. You heard me mention in the previous slide about scale. And scale is really about, you know, helping integrate that odd thing, in this case a house, into the landscape at large. And so we need plant masses that fit it. And so in this particular instance, you know, we've got just one layer of plant materials at the front of the house. It's really inadequate for visually anchoring that house in place. And just as a side note, we never want something pointy at the corners of houses. I know traditionally we've done that, but again, if the idea is to integrate those structures into the landscape, rounded plant material does it more than pointed plant material does. So pointed plant material actually reinforces that upright nature, in this case of the porch post, and makes it seem a little harsher. And so visual weight plays a big part of that. And so really what we want to see is, again, if the front door is the focal point, we want the plant material on either side of it to really visually weigh in and about equal one another. I'm not saying to put in the exact same plants. You certainly can do that. That lends a very formal approach to a landscape, but rather if you're looking for that informality, then you really want that visual weight to be of similar mass size. Okay. So these are the 10 things that I went through on creating curb appeal. And if drawing those things isn't your thing, if you are doing a bird's eye view and it's really hard for you to get an idea of what things look like or how those will fit into the landscape, then, and you're a visual kind of person, try instead utilizing your garden hose and some boxes. That may seem a little strange, but getting out the garden hose and laying it in a bed line so that you can see what shape the turf grass is going to have. Here's where the grouping of plants go. And then as a final step, once you're laying those bed lines out, get out the mower and follow those bed lines that you've created. If you can follow them easily, it's a winner, okay? If you shred the garden hose, or you find that you have to do an extra step and get out the weed eater as well, then maybe rethink where those bed lines are. And then get boxes that are about the same height and width as shrubs would be or as perennials would be, and put those in your landscape so that you get an idea of what size you need to really integrate that house into the landscape and give you good curb appeal. And so that's it for my presentation. If you have some questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Oh, and there's my contact information. So if you have a question along the way or want a point of clarification, I can certainly share that too.
Thank you, Kathleen. We did have a question along the way, and while we ask that, we'll let others think of questions they may have.
Okay.
When you showed the picture back, I think it was Right Plant, Right Place. There was a small shrub that you were talking about, and we had interest in knowing what the name of that shrub was again.
Okay, it's called Nikko Deutzia. Nikko is the cultivar name, Nikko, Deutzia, Deutzia. Deutzia. Deutzias are very old-fashioned plants. More than likely your grandparents had one in their yard, but there's newer inroads into the Deutzias that are really smaller in stature, and there's lots of cultivars on the market. Nikko is one of the most common ones that we see. So that's definitely doable. A lot of the spireas, you know, like Lime Mound and Lemon Mound and Little Princess, those are all smaller in stature. Stephanandra, there's another one that's maybe not well known, but is a nice small shrub for smaller landscapes. So there's a lot of cool things out there. And it's just a matter of watching, you know, like the Great Plants for the Great Plains program, or some of those other plant introduction programs that give you an idea of some of the newest and the best that's out there.
Thank you. We do have another question about native ground covers.
Mm-hmm.
Native ground covers that you find work well and you would recommend.
Well, hands down, my favorite has got to be just a second, I'll think of it after. We probably don't have that question anymore. Little wine cups. That is a really amazing ground cover for a full sun area. It does some beautiful wine red flowers. There's also another cultivar called Logan Calhoun that's white flowered. That was very nice. And it's what I call a knitter. It doesn't overwhelm plants that are next to it. Instead, it knits around their bases and just kind of spreads through the garden that way. So it does a really nice job of protecting the soil. Native pollinators that are ground nesters can make use of that space because they can fly into the foliage and get to the soil itself. So it's kind of a win-win. If you're thinking of shade spots, there's lots of things that can do well there. Some of those are like bloodroot and vinca minor, Baltic ivy. There's just a lot of cool things there that you can utilize for a shade space that are ground covers.
It's not in the questions, but one of the things that I wanted to ask was, if you've got a landscape and it's already there and you like most of it, but you're not sure about the rest of it, how would you go about trying to think of how you would redo that? So you kind of like it, but you're not sure that it's right based on what you talked about, but you really don't want to take it all out. Well, how can you visualize something like that? Would it be taking boxes again and moving those boxes, or can you help us with not starting from scratch?
Yeah. And actually of all the types of landscapes I like to do, it's those retrofitting ones that I like doing the best, because once you make those changes, not only does the space look better, but you have the maturity of some plants already in place. And so it doesn't have that, you know, little tiny plants, you know, filling a space not very well at first. And so it's nice when you're doing a retrofit like that. Probably the easiest way I know to do that, Carol, is, and let me just say this, that of all these principles and design ideas I provided, there are instances where you've seen the exact opposite of what I've recommended and you've liked it, or it looks good, and that's not unusual at all. You know, this image on the left, I'd be hard pressed to say that somebody would actually like it, but there may be somebody that actually likes that look. And so there are times when, even though it's not necessarily what I'm recommending. It's something that's something that you like. There's no reason why you can't leave that. But as a final step, the easiest way I know is to take a picture of the front of your house and put it on your computer screen, enlarge it if you need to, and then just visually start some of those things out, either by using your hand or a piece of paper or something to block those areas out. And if you find that you like the looks of that better, then that's actually the answer to your question then is, do I need to remove this or not? We as gardeners are loath to give up on any plant. And so even when it's a plant that's overwhelming a space or not in the right proportion, or something about it is off, if it's living, we tend to leave it there. And that can be a challenge then to get around that idea of, maybe this update needs to take in some of these other factors. So and what makes it doubly hard is when, you have a plant that next to it that is the right plant, but for whatever reason, it looks awful. And it's the one that looks really well next to it that needs to come out. That's a really tough choice. But making those choices makes a difference in the sense that if you find that when you block that with your hand or a piece of paper, and there's this sigh of, oh my gosh, that's what it needed, coming from you, then you have your answer there. I mean, it's really apparent then that plant needs to go. And then you can go about figuring out, do I try and move this, or do I just simply take it out and plant that same type of plant elsewhere where it makes more sense to have it. Does that answer your question, Carol?
I think it does, and I think you just gave me permission to throw away a few plants in the landscape that I've dealt with for many years and not really appreciated, but I always wanted to make them live. So
yeah. Well, and if you think about how we landscaped our front yards 50 years ago, we did a lot of yews, and we did a lot of hedging of those yews, and it was a very, very formal look to it. And a homeowner mentioned to me one time, it's kind of like the woman with her makeup on. She's ready to go. Having those trimmed hedges in the front really was about having that finished space for the neighborhood. And if the style of the house is formal, you can probably get by with that. But if the house is very informal in its look, then really having those hedges is awful. And further, it really violates that idea that, the front yard is your space too. Why not utilize it to your benefit to some extent, at least, whether it's adding some benches or something along that line. So getting away from that very formal look is something that I really applaud.
All right. So this is basically a question that was sent. In the landscapes you showed, there were very few dandelions. And so when we look at maintenance and we think of all those other things there, can you talk a little bit about maintenance of the lawn next to it and how to do that when we want the pollinators, we want all those kinds of things, and yet in my neighborhood, I've got a neighbor that I think somebody has moved out and nobody's in the house, and it's totally yellow right now because they have many. And I know many gardeners will leave a few dandelions, but most people don't want a whole field of dandelions. And can you talk about maintenance with that as we think about the landscape?
Sure. So I think there's nothing that causes greater discord among neighbors than weeds that seem to be coming from their yard into your yard. And so really when it comes to those things that benefit the pollinators like dandelions and clover, my recommendation is usually for people to choose their battles. And since the front yard is something that tends to belong to the neighborhood as a whole, really the placement of those things that some people call weeds should be given a space in the landscape. A lot of times it's in the backyard, which is okay. You know, people can put those things in the backyard. Have a spot where there's, you know, dandelions and clover and, you know, just maybe a little bit of a weedy area to benefit those pollinators. If you're doing, like I've asked, where you're actually making the front lawn an interesting shape in and of itself, then you immediately have limited the amount of weeds that you have to worry about in that lawn area. So if the aesthetic of the neighborhood is to have this pristine, you know, area of lawn, then it's really about choosing those weeds to place them somewhere else in the landscape. If, on the other hand, you have a very young neighborhood that really understands the benefit that all of those things provide, then there's going to be less pressure on you to have the dandelions and clover gone out of the front yard. Even if you look at 50 years ago, we seeded in clover into the front lawn at the same time that we seeded in the grass, because we knew that the clover fixes nitrogen and it benefited the lawn grass. But now, because we have the technology to selectively eradicate those things that aren't grass in our landscape, then we feel duty bound to do that, which is kind of a shame, because it made sense to do that, have those things together. So sometimes it's not our decision on what we have in the front. Sometimes it's dictated by the covenants that are in the neighborhood. But limiting the amount of turf grass is going to be the key thing. In this image on the left, you can see that, you know, there's a sidewalk and a street, and this area in between, we call that the inferno strip. The inferno strip is a really tough place to grow grass because of the salts that come through there in the winter months, and the amount of foot traffic that comes through there during the summer months. You can get those bare spots, and those bare spots are invitations for weeds to come in. And so I like the idea of eliminating turf grass in those inferno strips altogether, where instead of putting things in like turf grass, we go to something like some of the shorter native wildflowers, or the Mediterranean type plants, which are a lot of our herbs, you know, things like sage and oregano and thyme. They all have fuzzy leaves. And so if they get salt on them in the winter months, it doesn't bother them because they're holding that salt away with the fuzziness of the leaves. And so all of those kind of things in that inferno strip, to me, makes more sense than turf grass. And that would be a cool thing for if everybody did stuff like that. Transitioning to that, if you're in a neighborhood of a very traditional people, and you know, you have new ideas, making it seem intentional is important. So if, say for instance, you're putting a prairie spot in the front yard, then mowing an area around it so that it's very deliberate and people can see that it's deliberate makes all the difference in the world. And if you go one step further by having that spot certified as a monarch way station or a Nebraska certified pollinator habitat, that further educates people that this was intentional and that you meant to do that. So there are ways to do that. I have seen instances where people have tried to pass off an area as maybe a pollinator habitat, but when you see like an old chair laying on its side in that space, it's really hard to believe that that's the intention. So it's still about making things, taking care of things. It's about making it intentional looking.
Sounds good. Well, I think we got off a little bit on weeds here. We do have one more question that relates to weeds, and it's about the thing that goes around every year about using vinegar on weeds.
Okay.
Would you address that for us?
Oh, sure. So vinegar, also known as acetic acid, is a foliage burn down, does provide foliage burn down. Now, the vinegar that comes from the grocery store and is in our cupboard is 5% acidity. So it does burn down the plant that you spray it on. But most often the plant grows back from that. So it doesn't cause it. So a lot of our systemic products that are translocated to the root system, once you get root death of that plant, then that plant is gone altogether. But that's not the case with vinegar. It's just a burn down, and then a lot of times the root is unaffected. It sends out new growth. So the vinegar that comes out of your cupboard will have that type of effect. It's also non-selective, so anything the vinegar goes on could potentially burn other plants around it. Whereas the acetic acid that we purchase from the garden centers and nurseries is upwards of 10 to 15% acetic acid, and that has a little more long-term effect. Even though it's still a topical, it tends to have a more long-term effect and is more likely to burn down or burn roots as well. Same kind of thing though. You don't want to get it on something that's not targeted.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen. If there's anybody else with a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat. Caitlin, see you're on. I'll let you talk.
Yes. I am getting the evaluation right now, so if you guys just want to hold on for another second, thank you for the person that commented in there. I did forget on my end for that. So if you just want to hold on for a little bit, and I'll get that for you. So if you guys have any other questions, go ahead and post those in the chat here.
So while we're doing that, Kathleen, would you talk a little bit, would you entice people to come back this afternoon with what you're going to talk about?
Oh, absolutely. So my background is a little different in that I'm a landscape designer, but also I'm a certified arborist. And I answer a lot of questions through my work with extension. And after a while, there became kind of a theme I noticed where people were doing landscape things around their trees that, while it wasn't their intention to kill the tree, that's exactly what was happening. And so when I was working on my master's degree, I wrote an extension publication with Dr. Scott Josiah, where we looked at, some of these landscaping practices. And you noticed in this presentation I made here this morning that I talk about raised beds around trees being really hard on them, but there's other things that people have done to their trees as well. So I'm not saying that people can't landscape around trees. They absolutely can. It's just getting people to stay away from those silly practices where they build a raised bed, and you know how it is with one neighbor does it, then pretty soon everybody in the entire block is doing it. So we want to address those things so that people have an understanding that, here's some things that you can do to beautify the areas around your trees without killing them.
All right, thank you. Caitlin, you want to talk about the evaluation link right there?
Yeah, so I did just go ahead and post the evaluation link in the chat box. It looks a little different than the other ones just because I make a new link for each session that we have. So I took away the question of what session are you watching, just because I know exactly which one it goes to. So make sure to just copy and paste that link over into your internet browser. Unfortunately, it's not hyperlinked to go over into an internet tab for you. So just make sure that you copy and paste that. And I think we just had one other question in the middle of my two there. It says, are there ground covers which will outcompete Creeping Charlie?
No, not really. Not really. And in some instances, I've seen people like the fact that it's really the only ground cover that they have that does well in a dry shade location, and so they're just staying with that. But in a landscape situation, if it's turf grass that you're growing, if you do grow the turf grass dense enough, then the ground ivy really doesn't have a chance. And so having a good thick stand of turf grass is going to be your single best bet in a sunny location. In a shadier location, it's a little bit more of a challenge because the ground ivy has the advantage there of being able to withstand those conditions easily. But there are ground covers that also do well by shade, things like Vinca minor and Baltic ivy are a couple plants that come to mind. They're not super aggressive, and so it's still going to take some selective management of those. And sometimes if that plant is coming over from a neighbor's property, what's always handy to do is maybe band the property in maybe a 1 foot width of just plain mulch, so that when you see that ground ivy coming across the mulch, you can hit it with a herbicide at that point and manage it from even getting into your yard to begin with.
Awesome. It looks like that's all for questions. So just a reminder for everyone that Kathleen will be joining us again at the 3 p.m. session. So make sure to jump on for that. That's about landscaping around trees. So make sure to join us at 3. You can find the links for that on the Facebook page and then also the Siouxland Garden Show website page as well. So if you guys have any questions, you can get her contact information again at that session. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me. I'll go ahead and put my contact in the box really quick, and I can get you Kathleen's information. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you guys at 3.
Bye-bye.